Prince Albert defined his role to Queen Victoria as, "The position of Prince Consort requires that the husband should entirely sink his own individual existence in that of his wife, that he should make his position entirely part of hers, and fill every gap which as a woman she would naturally leave in the exercise of her regal functions." 100 years later, Prince Philip had a different view. "Amoeba, I'm just a bloody amoeba." A proud, upright and handsome man of action, Philip has dedicated his life to being number two. Always a few steps behind, always in the shadows. In his 80 years, he has progressed from penniless pawn to powerless prince, generating controversy and praise in equal measure. For an 80-year-old amoeba, he has had an extraordinary existence. Prince Philip, Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Gluckburg of the Royal House of Greece, was born on the 10th of June, 1921. He was the youngest of 5 and the only boy.
Philip didn't have a very good start in life. He was born on an island on the southern part of Greece, in an old dilapidated villa, actually born on a dining room table. There was no running water in the house, virtually nothing to eat either.
His mother, Alice, was beautiful, formidable, yet troubled. Deaf since birth, she had taught herself to lip-read in 4 languages. Philip's father, Andrew, was brother to the King of Greece. Shortly after Philip's birth, Andrew was involved in a disastrous military campaign and arrested for desertion.
They were caught up in internal conflicts within a very volatile part of Europe. Prince Andrew was actually court-martialed, and he was only really saved from the same death as Tsar Nicholas of Russia by British intervention.
King George V sent a destroyer in December 1922 to rescue Andrew and his family from execution. Philip was only 18 months old, and legend has it he slept for most of the voyage to Italy in an orange box. The family moved to Paris and lived a quiet, uneventful life in exile. Then, in 1931, as Philip approached his 10th birthday, everything changed. Within 6 months, his 4 sisters married German aristocrats and moved out of Paris. Prince Andrew went to Monte Carlo to be with his wealthy mistress. Princess Alice was admitted into a mental institution in Switzerland. The house in Paris was closed. Philip spent the next 2 years bouncing between his sisters in Germany and his mother's brother, George Milford Haven, in England.
So it was not surprising that, considering all 4 of the sisters had married Germans, that they wanted really to bring him up in Germany.
In 1931, the Nazis were on the rise. 2 of Philip's brothers-in-law were significant figures in the Nazi Party. Philip of Hesse was a good friend of Goering. Christopher of Hesse was appointed head of the Luftwaffe Research Center in 1932 and later worked for the Gestapo and the SS. Philip spent a year with his sisters in Germany and realized he was not Nazi material.
Therefore, I think it must have been very, very difficult for Prince Philip, and I think it took an act of great courage for him to make it plain that he'd rather throw in his hand with the British influence rather than the German.
Sir Leslie Hollis, former Commander-General of the Royal Marines, noted young Philip's hatred for Nazism. His dislike was intense for one so young. All that heel-clicking and saluting struck him as ridiculous. Philip moved permanently to England in the autumn of 1934. It was thought best I should move out. It was certainly a great relief to me. He attended Gordonston School. He was one of only 28 pupils.
The school in Gordonston was like kind of where Spartan warriors would have gone 4,000 years ago to be knocked into shape. Very much the emphasis on fresh air, clean living, lots of sport, lots of running around, lots of physical activity, rather like the muscular Christians of the 19th century.
Gordonston provided Philip with his first really secure home.
I think the young Philip particularly took root at Gordonston because he believed in, and still does, the sort of Stoic make a man of you principles of Kurt Hahn, but also because his arrival in this country, in these islands, was the beginning of him putting down roots.
When Philip left Gordonston in 1938, his sisters were caught up in Nazi Germany, and his uncle, George Milford Haven, had died of cancer aged 46. Philip was homeless. Enter the man who was to change Philip's fortunes forever, another of his mother's brothers, Louis Mountbatten. The next 10 years would see Philip transform from penniless pawn into a proud prince.
Prince Philip was basically handed over to Lord Louis Mountbatten, who later became Lord Louis Mountbatten, by the family as to become his sort of unofficial guardian in the 1930s.
Mountbatten recorded in his diary in 1938, "Philip was here all last week doing his entrance exams for the Navy. He had his meals with us, and he really is killingly funny. I like him very much." Philip began Navy training at Dartmouth in the summer of 1938.
Mountbatten wanted him in the Navy because he was a naval person. That was his career and had been his career, and he had thoroughly enjoyed it, Mountbatten. And he realised that Philip was just the sort of lad who the Royal Navy would probably do a power of good.
The following year, the royal family paid an official visit to the college. The two princesses, Elizabeth, 14, and Margaret, 9, were young and impressionable.
Mountbatten was always playing long-term, looking for future advantage for the Mountbatten family. So, although he could never perhaps suspected it would certainly come off, the fact that the young, handsome Philip, looking very Teutonic in a lot of ways, would almost certainly make a very vivid impression on the young Princess Elizabeth. It was Mountbatten who engineered the meeting between the two.
She was only a 14-year-old girl, very young. But Philip, who was then 19, absolutely showed off brilliantly. I mean, he did his utmost. And a very telling point is at the end, when they got on board their yacht, the Royal Yacht, and took off, all the lads got in their sailing boats for fun, these small one-handed sailing boats, and took off after the Royal Yacht to wave goodbye. After a while, they all turned back, except for one young man. That was Philip, who trailed them as far as he could until it got dark before he turned back. And she never forgot that.
Elizabeth was smitten. Governess Margaret Crawford wrote in her memoirs, "Philip was like a creature out of another world. Lilibet sat pink-faced, enjoying it all." Having said that, most 14-year-old girls would have been impressed by this handsome young man.
Elizabeth thought he was God's gift. I mean, he was a damn good-looking lad of 19. Fair-haired, blue-eyed, 6 foot 1 inch tall. I mean, every girl's dream man. And she began dreaming from that moment.
What, though, was the attraction of this innocent and rather spoilt little girl to an ambitious young man like Philip?
He wanted to show off to the royal family. He may have thought that at some stage this would help him become an equerry, perhaps, to the king at some future occasion, but he wanted to be the one they would remember out of all the young officers there.
Just as Mountbatten was always ambitious, so was Prince Philip. And Prince Philip, I think, saw Princess Elizabeth, had enjoyed perhaps meeting her, knew that she certainly had a crush on him, and it was something that he was prepared to move along wherever possible. I don't think they met very much, but they kept in correspondence. It was sort of a pen-pal relationship.
Philip flourished at Dartmouth. He was voted best all-round cadet and passed his final exams with distinction. On the 1st of January 1940, he was given his naval orders. After various postings away from the main war arena, he was sent to HMS Valiant in the Mediterranean Fleet in 1941, where he earned a mention in dispatches at the Battle of Matapan.
The The relationship between Philip and Elizabeth did continue off and on and very patchily throughout World War II. And she used to die for the days that he would come and stay over, or they'd go to the theatre together, but it was very few and far between.
Mountbatten pushed, gently. Philip once confided to a fellow officer, "My Uncle Dickie has plans for me. He thinks I should marry Princess Elizabeth."
Mountbatten was no fool. He knew that if he pushed it too hard, probably Princess Elizabeth or Philip would rebel against it. So it was gently, gently.
Occasionally, when Philip was back in England for ship refits, he and Elizabeth would meet. Over Christmas 1943, he joined the royal family and saw the now 17-year-old Elizabeth play the principal role in Aladdin. It is said that this was the first time sparks really flew. Meanwhile, like most sailors, Philip enjoyed his shore leave, especially with his Navy pal, Mike Parker.
Philip discovered very early on that whenever he went on shore leave, anywhere in the world, he got on extremely well with members of the opposite sex. And during that time, during the war, he met up with Mike Parker, and they became absolutely great buddies. I mean, they revelled together, they got drunk together, they went off with women together, they compared notes together, and they were as thick as thieves. And they enjoyed life as much as they could.
There was another friendship during the war that was special to Philip, nightclub singer Hélène Corday. They met as children in France in the 1920s. They met up again in London in the 1940s.
It had always been rumoured that Prince Philip had a child by Hélène Corday, and this child by the name of Max, was, for some unknown reason, went to live in China. But no one has ever spoken officially about it. It's been accepted unofficially that Max is his son, but no one really is worried, and Hélène Corday has never admitted that.
Meanwhile, Princess Elizabeth continued dreaming about Philip. After the war, the relationship gently blossomed. But many were against the match, not least Elizabeth's father, King George VI.
George VI wanted Elizabeth to have nothing to do with Philip. George VI, I'm afraid, saw right through him. He thought he was basically a ne'er-do-well out to grab his beloved, darling daughter. And King George VI did absolutely adore Elizabeth, there's no two ways about it.
Philip's German ancestry caused concern.
There was still a lot of anti-German feeling in the country. It was still well known. Beaverbrook, for instance, ran a virulent campaign in the Express against her marrying a German.
Some, including Elizabeth's mother, our Queen Mother, were suspicious of Mountbatten's intentions.
Mountbatten's aim in life had always been, if he couldn't be royal himself, his nearest and dearest could be royal. And therefore, when he saw the blossoming relationship between Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen of England, and Philip, this must have gladdened his heart.
Mountbatten was just as happy over the decision on Philip's name. Philip hadn't a surname. He simply called himself Philip of Greece. But he needed one to marry. The College of Arms suggested Oldcastle, but it was rejected as it sounded too much like a Yorkshire brewery. Mountbatten convinced the establishment that Philip should take the surname Mountbatten. It is the direct translation of Battenberg, Philip's mother's maiden name. It was a logical choice, but also a convenient one for Louis.
But of course, when Princess Elizabeth is going to get married, she will lose her surname, as it were, because it's the husband's surname that takes precedence. So in other words, she should be Elizabeth Mountbatten. I'll bet that Mountbatten spotted that from the word go and didn't tell anyone.
Mountbatten was also aware that Philip might be more palatable if he was British. He lobbied hard for Philip's naturalisation, and in February 1947, with the royal family conveniently in South Africa, the London Gazette quietly announced Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, RN, had become a British citizen. With a surname and a British passport, all that remained was some unfinished business in Germany. After the war, sensitive documents were discovered in Germany in the castle of Philip of Hesse, Philip's brother-in-law.
Prince Philip had corresponded with his sisters during the Second World War, which theoretically at least was a treasonable offence. That's the kind of correspondence that no king would want his future wife's husband, for that kind of correspondence to come to light. As the Allied armies swept through Germany, that kind of material was going to fall into either the hands of the Soviet Union or the hands of the British. And it was the British royal family, in the personages of Owen Morshead, the future librarian, and Anthony Blunt, who were sent out there to acquire the documents and forcibly bring them back to this country so that no one else could find out what it was all about.
Despite all these doubts, Elizabeth had set her heart on Philip. And Philip did have a few plus points.
Although in many other ways he was entirely unsuitable, he was broke, didn't have much to his name. He was royal. He came from a friendly royal dynasty. He knew how it worked, which in those days they regarded as one of the most important attributes of a royal bride or groom.
George VI eventually gave in and gave permission for Elizabeth to marry Philip as a result of pleadings by his wife, who is now the Queen Mother, that he should allow the wedding to go through. That's what really clinched the deal. But despite that, George VI was against it. I mean, if it had been left to him, he would never have permitted the marriage to go ahead.
Begrudgingly, the king gave in. The engagement was announced on the 10th of July 1947. In that instant, Philip stepped out of obscurity to become a public figure. On seeing newspaper headlines the following morning, Philip commented, "I read about myself as if I were some animal in a zoo. Elizabeth may have been in love, but was Philip?"
What is extraordinary about the sort of prenuptials is that Princess Margaret has been quoted as saying that she never saw Philip and Elizabeth like kissing in a passionate embrace, hardly even holding hands throughout the entire courtship. I mean, Margaret has said it was extremely straight, their relationship, and very correct indeed. And that surprised her, because she knew that Elizabeth was head over heels, literally, in love with Philip. And she saw, despite the fact, of course, being younger, that Philip didn't seem that enamoured, or didn't appear to be that enamoured, with Elizabeth.
Philip celebrated his final bachelor days in the traditional way. The official stag night was held at the Dorchester for the benefit of his aristocratic friends and the press. A secret stag night took place with his real friends at the exclusive men-only Thursday Club.
When Barron and the editor of the Daily Express, Arthur Christensen, formed the Thursday Club, they invited Philip to be a member, and he not only was a member, he would come almost every week to our meetings. We used to meet once a week at Wheeler's Restaurant in Old Compton Street. We had a room to ourselves. No one ever called him Prince Philip. No one ever said Your Highness or anything like that. What he got out of it was to behave like a human being.
On this particular Thursday, Philip was not in a party mood.
That stag night was the moment, the day before his marriage to the Princess Elizabeth, and he was frightened. I think he realized for the first time what he was getting into, the responsibility of his coming job, and he was scared.
Philip had every reason to be scared. The secret stag night didn't remain secret for long. His cousin and best man-to-be, David Milford Haven, sold the story of the stag night to the Daily Mail.
He sold it for £1,500. It's a disgrace. He lost all his contacts with the royal family for £1,500. It wasn't worth it.
On the eve of the wedding, the penniless pawn was promoted. The king would not allow his daughter to marry just a lieutenant. He became His Royal Highness Philip, Baron of Greenwich, Earl of Merioneth, Duke of Edinburgh. (20th of November 1947), the wedding. Churchill described the day as a flash of colour along a hard road we have to travel.
Here was the first opportunity in 1947, after World War II, for Britain to smile, to enjoy themselves, to rejoice.
It was a lavish affair. Too lavish for some.
It's very revealing to look at the records in the Public Records Office of the royal wedding in 1947. On the one hand, the royal family wanted to make the most of it. Those kind of bread and circus events are absolutely vital to their survival. On the other hand, they must not prove that they are so distant from the rest of the population that they are regarded as out of touch. 1947, it was still rationing, the weather was appalling, the winter and so on. And so really, I think whatever the wedding had been like, someone would have criticised.
But there was outrage when it became known that silk for the princess's dress was brought in from abroad to bypass rationing quotas. Prime Minister Clement Attlee questioned the need for 11 wedding cakes. One slice consumed a week's sugar ration for the average family. Philip and Elizabeth quickly settled into married life.
He liked all that went with being married to the future queen. On the other hand, he also wanted just that little bit of freedom, that little sense that he wasn't quite one of them.
Within 3 months of the wedding, Elizabeth was pregnant. And Philip returned to sea.
Philip had gone back to being in the Navy. He was a serving naval officer, so the Queen was a serving naval officer's wife. If they look back at their married life together, that first 5 was their happiest time. I mean, he had a job, a fulfilling job, she was looking after him, and they could spend the rest of the time making babies.
But Philip still hankered after the way things were. He appointed his old naval pal, Mike Parker, as his private secretary.
It would have confirmed the suspicions of the old-time courtiers that Prince Philip had to be watched like a hawk, because there he was, appointing as his trusted aide someone who was outside the magic circle. Someone who would support Prince Philip in that sense of independence and going his own way as far as possible.
Together, Parker and Philip would sneak off into the West End under the pseudonyms of Murgatroyd and Winterbottom to let their hair down. The press was never far away. It was the press that broke the news of Philip's night out, clubbing with one of Britain's best-known film stars.
One of the people whose company enjoyed, was an aspiring would-be actress called Pat Kirkwood, whose legs were sometimes regarded as the 8th wonder of the world.
The press was convinced Philip and Kirkwood were more than just dancing partners. One paper even reported that Philip bought Kirkwood a white Rolls-Royce to silence her.
The king was told about it, and he was absolutely livid. But by then they were married. And what the king wanted to ensure was that she should remain happily married. And Mountbatten was brought in to, have words with Philip and told him that he had to behave himself.
Interviewed in 1988, Kirkwood denied there had been a romance. Well, certainly it was a fun evening. We danced for about 2 hours, waltzes, sambas, the lot. I admit, if he hadn't been married, I might have developed a crush on him. He was great company and there was a lot of joking and laughing, but despite all those rumours, we did not have an affair. Meanwhile, Philip became a father on the 14th of November 1948 with the arrival of Charles, and 20 months later, Anne arrived on August the 15th, 1950. With a happy family, a beautiful wife, and a hectic social diary, life was sweet for Philip. But it all turned sour in 1952. Elizabeth and Philip were on safari in Kenya when they were told that King George had died. The register at Treetops on the 6th of February 1952 reads, "A young girl climbed into a tree one day as a princess and left next day as a queen. God bless us."
It was an event over which he had no control whatsoever. He goes from being the dominant male in their household to a serving naval officer, someone whose word was law, and he suddenly becomes someone who has to walk several steps behind, who really is very much the afterthought.
His life changed as she went to get out of the plane. because they came onto the plane to explain to him, and he was going to follow, and they said, like that. And he was made to stand still while she walked on her own down the steps of the plane. From that moment, his life changed. He was no longer equal.
He had run things his own way, and having to buckle under and become number two to the Queen was a tremendously hard thing for him to do. Frustration bubbled out of him. Certainly in the early days of the marriage, it was very, very difficult for him to be confined by the rules of Buckingham Palace.
Immediately, Philip was forced to give up his navy career.
Princess Elizabeth was thrust onto the throne younger than she would have wished. I think this was very tough for Philip. He loved his navy career. He was pursuing it. He wanted his own command. This was denied him because of this sequence of events.
Philip did not take kindly to his new role in life. I mean, he really was very annoyed, principally because he was ordered to leave the Royal Navy, and that although he pleaded that he should be permitted to stay on in the Royal Navy and have it as a career, they just said, no, this is your job. Your job is to support the monarch for the rest of your life.
It was now dawning on the establishment the extent of Mountbatten's scheming. Mrs. Mountbatten was now Queen.
Lord Louis once made the bad mistake of saying at a dinner party, it's now the Mountbattens who are the rulers of this country. The Mountbattens have joined the royal families. Those are the kind of remarks that instantaneously get passed back both to the Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, and passed back to the royal authorities. And they realised that theoretically he was in fact correct, that when Princess Elizabeth had married Philip, the Mountbattens were in fact now the ruling clan. They moved to change it.
It was ordered that the name of the British royal family would remain Windsor. Elizabeth signed the order in council on her 26th birthday.
He's called himself sometimes a bloody amoeba because he realised that everything was being taken away from him, that he could not even, unlike every other man in Britain who gets married retains their surname, he was the one person who was not allowed to do so.
Then, in June 1953, the coronation confirmed Elizabeth's position as the head of state and Philip's as an amoeba. Elizabeth immersed herself in her new demanding job.
Elizabeth decided very early on, after being crowned, that she had become, at that moment, wedded to the crown, and that her marriage should take second place. And it is suggested that she took it even into the bedroom, for the simple reason is that it was another 10 years, of course, before she had Prince Andrew, which really, was quite a long time in those years. But she took her job so seriously that she, I understand, thought that she couldn't get pregnant during those times because she shouldn't get pregnant.
Protocol placed Philip way down the line of command.
Throughout his public life, he has to be a couple of paces behind her, allow her preeminence in everything. When she opens Parliament and sits on the throne, he's always at her side. He's always at her side, but he's always inferior. And one is led to believe this happens quite a lot in private too, because the royal family live in such a formal way, even in private, that if Prince Philip arrives in the room after his wife, even if they're just having friends to dinner, he has to apologize to her.
Prince Philip has always, constitutionally, had a very limited role to play. There is no legal reason whatsoever for Prince Philip to see any of the state papers, to know anything about the weekly audience between the Queen and the Prime Minister. All of that he's excluded from.
I think Philip got on particularly well with Dennis Thatcher while Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister, because they were both the leading members of what Philip called the backseat club. They were both men of some distinction or some achievement who had to take second place to their wives.
If protocol denied Philip power and influence within the palace, then he would direct his energies outside. In the mid-1950s, Philip made hundreds of public appearances. He took up flying, He was made Chief Ranger of Windsor Great Park. He attended the Olympic Games in Helsinki. Anything that would get him away from the pompous old guard in the palace. He also became involved in charities, whose aim was to help young people. As president of the National Playing Fields Association, his task was to raise £500,000 to build new playing fields in every town in the country. He persuaded Frank Sinatra to donate royalties from 2 best-selling records to the cause, and reached his target within 4 years. And it was Philip who brought the Variety Club to Britain in the late 1940s.
Variety Club is a charity that is helping children, whatever their problems, any form of handicap or if they are deprived in any way. There was a meeting of some film people at the Savoy Hotel, attended by His Royal Highness Prince Philip, and they told him of the work of Variety Club, and it was his suggestion that they formed a tent, called a tent, here in the United Kingdom. And I can tell you, out of his very busy diary, he still finds 3 or 4 occasions, and on every occasion he always visits the club, sees the boys and sees the parents and sees the leaders.
But the charity for which he's best known owes its existence to Philip's years at Gordonston and in the Navy.
Well, the Duke of Edinburgh's award started about 45 years ago. The Duke of Edinburgh saw lots of young people leaving school at about 15, those who were not going for the higher education. And there was a gap of 3 years before they went off to national service, in which perhaps they didn't get up to the best things with their lives. And he felt there was a need to fill that hiatus with some activities, some interests, some hobbies that would employ young boys, as it was in the very early days. So that was really the genesis, and he then got hold of John Hunt, who had led the Everest expedition, and enthused him with the idea as well. And behind also was Kurt Hahn, the headmaster then of Gordonston, who I think was the philosophical guru behind the whole philosophy of the award.
By 1989, 2 million teenagers had taken up the challenge. Defying the advice of never working with animals and children, he also began campaigning for the Worldwide Fund for Nature in 1951. As someone who enjoyed shooting tigers, Philip defends his position by claiming it is no different to a green butcher killing animals and selling the meat. In 1956, Philip was invited to open the Olympics in Melbourne. Grasping the opportunity to get away from the palace, Philip built a 40,000-mile world tour. He called it his personal contribution to the Commonwealth ideal. In October 1956, the Queen, Charles, age 7, and Anne, age 6, waved their father and his friend Mike Parker goodbye.
Much has been written about Philip's fantastic trip to the Melbourne Olympics in 1956, where he was accompanied by Mike Parker. There were various reasons why Philip went there. He wanted to escape the close confines of life in England. And do remember, in the 50s, the establishment was still a very tough place in which to try to enjoy one's life. Things with Elizabeth really weren't going very well at all because she was wedded to the monarchy. So there's many reasons why he went there. But one does understand that did Mike Parker and Philip enjoy themselves? And the answer is yes, they did.
Without the Queen, he was top dog. He didn't have to walk behind anybody.
I mean, there we have 9 months tootling around the world on a huge, great yacht, the centre of the attention of the kind of people they wanted, friends, charming young ladies. The opportunities were there. Why not take them?
Meanwhile, back in the UK, all was not well. Mike Parker's wife sued for divorce on the grounds of adultery. Parker was forced to resign as Philip's private secretary.
They feared that if the 2 men were permitted to go on as before, then real trouble could ensue down the line, and they wanted a divorce as quickly as possible, and he was kicked out unceremoniously.
I thought it was a great shame that due to the publicity about he and Philip and so-called girlfriends, he had to break off his relationship with Mike Parker. I think this hurt very much. We all like Mike. I never met anybody who disliked Mike Parker. He was a wonderful man.
The Parker resignation was to trigger some unwelcome public and press criticism of the royal family. Philip took notice.
The effect of these criticisms simply encouraged Prince Philip in his ideas to try and modernise and drag the royal family into the 1950s or maybe even the 1960s.
So he then had the bright idea of modernising Buckingham Palace. And to be fair, my God, it did need modernising. I mean, it was still roughly the way it had been in the 1930s, if not the 1920s. I mean, you know, tiny little lights along dark, dank corridors, furnishings that had been there for 50 or 80 years. Nothing worked, the telephones hardly worked, the bells hardly worked, the electricity hardly worked, except in various areas.
I think he was frustrated by the old guard that had clung on. Some of them had been there since before the abdication. They were very crusty old courtiers who believed in doing things the old way. And the one great virtue of Philip was that he was a moderniser. He'd seen in his own country the difficulties faced by a corrupt and rather run-down monarchy. And he knew that monarchy could work. It was still acceptable to many civilised nations.
At the same time, Philip set about supplementing his own lifestyle.
Prince Philip did, however, turn his own study, into a ship's cabin. And he had it all decked out as though he was on board ship still, where he used to go to read books and watch television when it arrived, listen to the wireless, as it was then called.
In the next few years, Philip acquired 2 aircraft of the Queen's flight, 2 Westland helicopters, 4 Rolls-Royces, all for official engagements and all funded by the Treasury. For his own fun, he bought 7 polo ponies, 8 family horses, a catamaran, 4 yachts, and another pram. On the 19th of February 1960, their 3rd child, Andrew, was born. Author Kitty Kelly questioned why, after a gap of 10 years, a 3rd child was conceived. She also commented on Andrew's likeness to the Queen's racing manager, Lord Porchester.
There have from time to time been suggestions that not only was Prince Philip putting it about, but that Elizabeth got involved with 1 or 2 amours. I've looked into these, and there are possibilities that Elizabeth had, how can I put it, very close friendships with 2 or 3 men in her life. But never to the degree of having an affair.
To add to the intrigue is the unusually long embargo placed on cabinet records relating to the royal family in 1959. Macmillan felt the contents sensitive enough not to release the papers for 100 years, as opposed to the usual 30. In 2059, Philip will be 138, and Andrew 99. Next, the 1960s and the scandal that would bring the establishment to its knees. Profumo. Was Philip involved? The decade started with the scandal that put the swing into the 60s. Profumo. As a regular at the Thursday Club, Stephen Ward had been acquainted with Philip for many years.
Stephen Ward had a very, very strong reputation as a man who could sort of take away all your aches and pains. And it got around in society. They all would meet up and drink lots of champagne. Oysters were a necessity. They always had to have oysters for the libido. And it was a sort of jolly lunch that stretched into the afternoon. And then on to parties. And Philip was very fond of these.
I think Philip certainly knew most of the people who were involved in the Stephen Ward affair and the Christine Keeler affair. He certainly knew them.
In 1961, Ward, an accomplished artist as well as osteopath, was given permission to sketch 8 members of the royal family, including Philip. The sketches were being exhibited at a gallery in London as the Profumo scandal broke. The palace did not want any association with Ward and sent Anthony Blunt to buy the sketches. Harmless sketches were one thing, incriminating photographs quite another. Photographs, allegedly featuring Philip, Ward and 2 girls, found their way to the offices of press baron Cecil King. In June 1963, King ran a story in the Daily Mirror. It read, "The foulest rumour being circulated about the Profumo scandal is that it has involved a member of the royal family. The name mentioned is Prince Philip." The report went on to say the rumour was unfounded. As well as rumours about Profumo, speculation about Philip's attraction to the stars of stage and screen continued.
He did go for the sort of film star type people because those are the ones that attracted him. As well, let me say, as numbers of polo wives, 2 or 3 of whom have told me that they'd had their flings with Philip.
Merle Oberon, Daphne du Maurier and others have all been mentioned, but nothing has ever been confirmed.
I think possibly the greatest blood sport there has been in the history of 20th century journalism is Fleet Street chasing after Prince Philip, chasing after women. And Fleet Street has been waiting for 40 years to try and nail Prince Philip in bed with another woman. They've never managed to be able to do it. They never will be able to do it.
Philip is also thought to have had relationships with people closer to home.
Princess Alexandra was about 15 years younger than Philip, and she had always had an eye for Philip. And she was a most engaging young woman. Alexandra and Philip did get together, and for 20 years the friendship continued, which has always been kept very, very quiet. The Queen knew about it, of course. She knew it had been going on.
With their 4th child, Edward, born in 1964, the swinging 60s drew to a close. The public's interest in the affairs of the royal family was to intensify in 1969, when Philip agreed to allow a film crew into the palace to record the royal family at home.
In the short term, this film was an immense success and boosted the ratings, made them seem human much more so than before. In the long term, of course, it's been a disaster because it created this insatiable public appetite for royal titbits of every kind that led to the disasters of the 80s and 90s in the next generation.
The next generation was in the hands of Charles and Anne. Philip and Charles have never been close.
The relationship with Charles has been most unfortunate. Started by bullying him, continued to bully him all his life. Charles never felt that he could go to him. And sometime before the wedding to Diana, Charles suddenly heard that Prince Philip had decided not to receive any more phone calls for him and didn't want any letters from him either. And he cut him off. It has always been suggested that those that know Philip well is that he was jealous of Charles from the day he was born, because he was going to succeed to the throne. He was the heir. And Philip has never been anything in the royal family, really, except the father of the children.
Anne, on the other hand, is much more Philip's cup of tea.
Anne probably was the son that Philip always wanted. He is a hard man and he wants his children to be hard. And there were aspects of Charles's softness which he could never get along with.
But it was what the children did in their private lives which was to cause Philip the most concern.
In 50 years, Prince Philip has gone from the arch-modernizer to the arch-conservative. He's now more royal than the royals themselves.
I think he thought that Diana was beneath contempt. When she collaborated with Andrew Morton on his book, he saw all the work that he had done since 1947 to the House of Windsor just blown apart, smashed to smithereens.
I think 1992 was as much an annus horribilis for Philip as it was for the Queen. Behind the scenes, I think he was able to play a more active role than the Queen in the problems of his children's marriages, 3 of which either broke up or got separated or divorced in the same year.
If 1992 was bad, 1997 would make or break the monarchy.
In death as in life, Philip felt that Diana was a threat to the House of Windsor. He could see her achieving some kind of godlike status. He went out and saw those flowers outside Buckingham Palace, outside Kensington Palace, and he could see a myth being created overnight.
It was Charles who, sensing the mood of the nation, stood up to his father and insisted Diana receive a state funeral. Philip had argued for a private ceremony. For once, he had been overruled. It was a symbolic moment in his life as head of the family. Prince Philip is a complex and contrasting character. Arch-royalist, yet modernizer. Champion of the nation's youth, yet distant father. He is much more than just an amoeba.
Those that actually know Philip will realise that it was a great pity, probably, that the Queen married him, because he didn't really support her personally. He was there for her, standing 2 steps behind her, but in their private life he gave her little support, gave his children no support, and we've seen what's happened there.
Prince Philip picked up the House of Windsor off the floor. He put backbone back into it. He put a polish on it. He gave it a pride in itself, and he allowed its sovereign to shine.
It was tremendously promising life, but he couldn't control himself, couldn't contain himself. And he has let down not only the Queen, but particularly the children. And I think that's what his legacy will unfortunately turn out to be.
He stood back. He was not jealous of the Queen. He was supportive. He was creative. Of course, he was difficult and bolshy, but I think that what he did was, for all royalists who believe in the continuing existence of the House of Windsor, he took a really rather ramshackle piece of machinery and turned it into a shining thing of beauty.
What people think of him is not something that would unduly concern Philip. As he once said, "I am not really interested in what goes on my tombstone."